Hello and welcome back to round 4 of the Menorca Open. As we saw in the previous video, we got a kind of unfortunate pairing playing against one of our friends from the US, but managed to take home the win anyway. In round 4, the unfortunate pairings continued, and in this round we were paired against another one of our American friends, FIDE Master William Grafe. Now, this has been a kind of difficult opponent for me over the years growing up. We've played 2 or 3 times before, maybe 3. But I don't think I've actually ever beaten him going into this game. And in fact, I've been in very, very deep trouble in all of the games that we've played, even though in all of them I was like 100, 200 points higher rated. I was very, very lucky not to lose really all of the games that we played. Something stylistic, perhaps, about the matchup poses some problems for me. Not sure exactly what it is. Maybe it's just random fluctuation. But I was really unhappy with this pairing for a number of reasons. First of all, playing the black pieces against a 2200-ish level player is always very unpleasant. It's like just low enough rated where you basically need to win, at least some percentage of the time, but it's very much a strong enough player that can beat you if you mess around too much. And not like it can beat you in like, oh, if the stars align, like they can be. It's like if you mess around too much, you will get beat. So even on paper, this is kind of already an unpleasant matchup. Also, same question as last time, why are we flying to Spain to play each other when we could just do that in the States? And it's also just always unpleasant, especially in these, obviously in chess you're going to play against your friends to some extent. Everybody knows everybody in chess at least a little bit, and you can only avoid these types of pairings for so long. But especially in these massive opens, and especially in these massive opens in foreign countries, you don't really expect to be playing your friends all that often. Like the people that you're hanging out with between rounds, it's kind of unpleasant. So all of this stacked up to a somewhat unfortunate pairing. But you got to do what you got to do. So I tried to prepare a little bit for this game. Now, FIDE Master William Grafe is also a YouTuber you guys should all check out. He goes by Gambit Man here on YouTube, and he has a lot of really, really cool videos on a lot of very, very interesting gambits, many of which I haven't heard of. And so most of my preparation for this game, honestly, came from, trying to think about what opening has the worst gambits against it. Not because I really expected him to play like some terrible gambit in Classical against me. I thought that was quite unlikely no matter what opening I played. But I figured that since he spends, a lot of his time playing these gambits online and making content out of them, and again, you should check them out. They're quite entertaining. He probably has less experience in the main lines of most openings, and so even if I play an opening that I'm not super familiar with, he's probably going to be even less familiar with it, and we can get a fresh game that way. Plus, I have the added bonus of if he does decide that he wants to go for some psychotic gambit, then let's pick an opening where that's shooting himself in the foot a little bit. And so after e4, which I very much expected my opponent to play, now most openings have at least some reasonable gambit. Against the Sicilian, there's obviously the Smith-Mora, which is probably the best of the gambits. If you're going to sort of rank the questionable gambits, this is going to be clear and away number one. Against e5, there are any number of gambits. There's, of course, the Scotch gambit, maybe even the Danish or Goring gambit, depending on how white wants to play it. But there are also, many, many early d4s in most of these lines. For example, d4 is already possible here, aiming for like a kind of Max Lange attack or some kind of Scotch gambit transposition. A lot of options. There's also, of course, the Evans gambit, which is also reasonably respectable. This one at least doesn't leave white worse. And so I didn't really want to play either c5 or e5. If I play the Caro, there are a number of true or interesting gambits along the way. For example, d4, d5, like white can play the Fantasy, which is not quite a gambit, but can become one. White can play like, I don't remember what it was he actually recommends here. I think like bishop e3 or something is something that he plays sometimes. But there's also, this stuff like bishop c4, which can turn into a gambit with bishop b3, giving away the e4 pawn. There are a lot of sort of at least reasonable looking gambits. What there aren't very good gambits against is the French defense, and this is what I decided to end up playing. There really isn't a clean way to just sort of give a pawn here and play for activity, with the one exception of this sort of advanced variation where white has tried to avoid playing c3 and instead playing knight c3 takes bishop d3 and just kind of leaving this pawn here. This is sort of a gambit. I guess I really wouldn't even call this a gambit, to be honest, because white often just does go collect this pawn back. It's sort of just a different way of playing the position. But I thought that was possible that he might do that. What he did instead was play knight d2 and enter some of the main lines of the Tarrasch, which I was very happy to see because I actually do have some experience from the black side of this. I have maybe 3 or 4 games from when I was much younger in this line, and I actually had pretty good results with it. And I suspected that my opponent probably wasn't going to be super well versed in the main lines here, so I had some, evil ideas prepared. Not specifically for this game, because I didn't really know that he was going to play the Tarrasch, but once he played it over the board, I was thinking further ahead, and I realized that there are some places along the way that I can deviate, which we'll see momentarily. So I went ahead and played c5, which is one of the older main lines. Bishop e7 is sort of the modern thing, just kind of a waiting move, waiting for white to either commit to knight f3, in which case we can, there's no more f4, so we can start playing in sort of classical French style with c5, knight f3, or to commit to something like e5, trying to, well, I guess after e5, I'm not sure what the difference is. Okay, I guess after knight f3, we can now commit to something like knight f6, knight d7, in like a true classical French style, since there's no f4. And then after e5, I can't remember exactly what the difference is here. I guess we go for an immediate c5, and the point is we haven't spent some time on this. It's been a while since I've looked at this stuff, but c5 is an old main line that's still very, very respectable. White goes ahead and takes on d5. The other main move is to play knight f3, just defending the pawn. This also has a lot of theory attached to it. I think this occurred in the World Championship. Ding playing black. I don't remember in this World Championship. Probably not the one against Gukesh. But I believe Ding played this with black against Nepomniachtchi in probably the last World Championship or something. But taking on d5, also an old main line. All of this is reasonably well known. White can also take on c5 here, but my opponent went for the old classical stuff. So white gains some time harassing the queen, and then that buys some time to castle. It's important not to go try to collect his pawn immediately with knight b3, because then queen b4 is a very annoying fork that gains some time, since white is basically forced to bring the knight back. So white castles first and only then goes after recollecting the pawn. Knight c6, knight b3, and now it's far too greedy for black to try to hold the pawn by playing e5. Black is just far too underdeveloped for that, and white gets a very, very, very powerful initiative. So black generally just gives the pawn on d4 back, and after takes, this is where I decided was an interesting point to deviate. The main move by far is to play a6, preventing either piece from going to b5. And then intending to follow up with queen c7, hitting the bishop and getting the queen out of the way. For example, after rook e1, queen c7, bishop to b3. Black now plays bishop to d6, attacking h2, and there are some very, very long lines here, including most famously knight f5, which sacrifices the h2 pawn, and after castles, white continues the sacrificial attack by giving a full piece away with takes on g7. Black generally throws in rook d8, queen f3, takes on g7, bishop h6, king g6. It's a long line. c3, intending bishop c2, and, the line goes on, but this ends in a draw. Pretty convincingly. There are a number of games that have gone through this, and this is, at some point, was like a fairly popular way to just play out a prearranged draw. But obviously we're not trying to do that. I wasn't trying to just allow white to force a draw out of the opening. In fact, the whole point of playing the French was, or part of the point of playing the French was not to allow white to force a draw out of the opening. And in addition to that, my opponent actually spent quite a lot of time leading up to this position, despite the fact that we were still very much in a main line. And so I wanted to exploit that by introducing some deviation as early as possible. So instead of a6, which was by far the main move, I instead played this move bishop d7. Now this move is obviously less accurate, but I remember looking at this back in the day because I had this sort of the question when I was a teenager playing this line of what do we really need to spend a move on a6? Like, is that truly necessary? And the answer was no. As far as I recall, I remember bishop d7 was playable. I don't remember it's actually very good. We can check. I don't remember what, but my bar for playable back in the day might have been quite a bit lower. But yeah, it looks like it's just fine. No big difference. We can check also what people have played here. Yeah, it is just the second main line. Seems fine. But it definitely, I could definitely tell it was surprising my opponent because he spent quite a lot of time here, which makes sense if you've never seen this move before. It's sort of like you have to wonder, like, okay, well, if black always plays a6, why is that? Is that because, you know, maybe knight b5 is a problem, maybe bishop b5 is a problem? You do have to spend some time trying to work out the differences, and after a pretty long think, my opponent decided that, you know, he kind of had to take up the challenge. If I hadn't played a6, there must be a reason, and went ahead and played knight b5. Queen c5 is pretty much forced. We need to keep contact with the c7 square. My opponent played queen e2, and now we play a6, evicting the knight from b5. And then the point is that after bishop e3, white has gained some time harassing the queen around, for sure. But it's not critical time, and white has also wasted time by bringing the knight to b5 and then probably bringing it back. So after knight d4, for example, I thought, okay, we can play bishop d6, we could play queen c7, either way. Seems like a pretty natural development plan. We could put the bishop on e7 as well. At some point, we could play d5 to harass this bishop. Overall, should be perfectly acceptable for black. And I remember that, you know, this position evaluates to basically equal, so I wasn't quite sure what the follow-up was, but I wasn't very concerned. My opponent instead played knight to c3, which I thought was a bit odd, because the knight is not particularly well placed here. It is very well controlled. It doesn't really go anywhere. So I kind of overlooked my opponent's idea with this. I played the move bishop d6, which is already probably a little inaccurate. I wanted to continue with the plan of putting pressure on h2, but it was probably safer to just put the bishop on e7. Play bishop e7, castle, put the bishop on c6, and black should already be maybe even a little bit better, certainly no worse. We can follow up with b5 and queen b7 maybe to put pressure on the long diagonal. For example, bishop e7 if white plays bishop d4, as he did in the game. Then after castle, something like rook d1, b5, bishop b3, bishop c6. Again, this knight is very well controlled. Black has no weaknesses. We're going to follow up with queen b7, attack g2, put the rooks on d8 and c8, maybe play a5, a4. Black is doing very, very well. But I played bishop d6 instead. I don't think it's bad just yet, but it is probably a little inaccurate. And now after bishop d4, we see kind of the quote-unquote problem. Now this knight is under attack in the sense of it'll ruin black's pawn structure. But what I was counting on was this move queen c7, which turns out to be a pretty considerable blunder. For some reason, this is kind of a very bizarre thought process. But for some reason, what I thought was that after knight d5, which is the point of my opponent going to c3, is that he now has this threat on d5 occasionally, is that for some reason I thought I could actually take on h2, and after king h1 play, what do I want to play here? Well, I guess queen e5. Queen e5. No, there's definitely something else, because queen e5, I saw this much, that white can just play queen f3. Now we can't really take, because the queen is falling. For example, after rook e1 takes, white won't take immediately, although he probably could, because now we have a rook and two pieces for the queen. But after, well, actually, okay, we have to be a little bit careful about where we put the queen, actually. We might have to cheat a little bit, because if we put the queen on f3, then there's issues with bishop c6. So white might have to be a little bit clever about where the queen goes. Maybe d2 is the better one. So now after takes, rook p1 takes, again, white could take. Probably shouldn't, but could. But now after g3, white is going to collect the queen, but also trap this dark square bishop. And bishop c6 is no longer dangerous because the queen is not stuck on this diagonal. So that was no good, but the other move I overlooked here was something really simple. I'm struggling to remember now. But basically it boiled down to the fact that I forgot that taking on f6 was check. And so there just isn't as much counterplay as I thought there was going to be. So this whole idea is, like, if we take on h2 and then queen e5 is kind of forced instead of some other move I was hoping to play, like really forgot what my plan was here. Which I guess indicates that it probably wasn't a very good plan. But in any case, after knight d5, we are basically forced to retreat the queen instead, because we can't take on h2, which is very unpleasant. And now our structure is damaged, and this knight is suddenly very, very powerful. Our king is caught in the center, and this looks pretty dire. Oh, okay, yeah, this was the idea. My idea was that I could go to d8, because after rook d1, I thought that after bishop c6, intending to just take on d5, then after knight takes f6, I forgot that this was check, so I thought that I could play bishop takes h2 here. And after king takes h2, take on f6, and black is probably just fine. Maybe not better, but fine. And after bishop c6, if white plays like rook e1 or something, then we're probably reasonably comfortable to just castle. Again, forgetting that knight takes f6 is check. That was the main thing that I overlooked in this position. It actually wasn't. My opponent after the game thought that I probably overlooked like queen d2 or something here, which would make sense. That's a very reasonable thing to expect. But I missed an even stupider thing, which is that this is check after queen d8 or d1. So once we reached this position, I realized by now, of course, okay, well, knight takes f6 is a threat, and it is check. If we play bishop c6, then now after takes, white is up a very comfortable pawn, and black is in very, very big trouble. White is also threatening to take on e6, so we don't even have time to try to grab the pawn back. Even as sort of vaguely dangerous as this would look, it also concretely is almost certainly getting checkmated. So the only way to try to defend this pawn at f6 is to plow forward with it with f5, which looks visually quite terrible, because it is. My opponent found a very powerful move, queen h5, and at this point I realized that the position is really, really brutal for black. There really are just no moves for black to speak of. This king is never really getting the safety. We could try to go to the queen side, but then we'd have to move the queen, and it's not really clear where to go. That's the main point, I think, of queen h5, is this occupies both the g5 and h4 squares. So this queen has nowhere to go along this diagonal that would allow black to castle queenside, and we would have to go along this diagonal because we need to keep control of the f6 square. So, you know, if we went to a5, for example, then knight f6 is just winning on the spot. White can take, and then take on f7, take on e6 as well. Everything's collapsing. Black is losing the house. So even though there's no immediate threat for white, per se, you know, if it's white's move in this position, he's not, like, immediately taking big material or anything. Black is completely paralyzed. There's really just no legal move. And white is just going to continue bringing pieces into the game, put pressure on f5 maybe, play queen h6, and knight f6 is also a very, very powerful threat. Black is almost lost. Well, I shouldn't even say almost lost, probably just is lost is a better way of putting it. If we go ahead and take this, then, well, there's any number of problems, one of which is check. We can't run with f8, with the king at f8, because after queen h6, white, very worst case, is just taking here, and this endgame is completely winning, because our rook is completely out of play. There's probably even more violent ways of doing it, like rook takes d5, and then doubling on the d file. Looks also very unpleasant. And if we slide back with bishop e7 or something, then once again, worst case, white is just taking on d5. putting pressure. Rook takes d5, also very unpleasant, threatening rook e5, threatening rook d1. White is assuredly going to pick the material back up, and black is pretty much doomed. So at this point I understood, okay, well, we've basically blundered the game away as early as move 20, but we need to find some way to keep the game going. You know, my opponent does have, like, I think it was down to like 15, 20 minutes at this point, so there was a tiny glimmer of hope that maybe he'd misplayed the attack in time pressure. But there was no doubt that this was a lost position, so we took some, you know, slammed the panic button, took some desperate measures, and held our nose and castled the king. This looks like it's castling into very, very serious danger, which is true. My opponent played rook d3, which I expected, intending rook h3, and there is no particularly good defense of the h7 pawn. So we decided that we had to give it away. This is all this I foresaw from castling, with a move bishop e5, and after rook h3, rook e8. The hope was that after takes on h7, king f8, we would be able to, you know, if this knight moved away, since now it is really under attack, if the knight moved away to like e3 or something, then after like queen f6, for example, we can maybe get the king back to the center, make use of the open files, and have some, probably not full compensation for the pawn, but definitely some practical issues for white. The problem, as my opponent found here, is that white is in no rush to take on h7. He can do that kind of whenever. And instead he can start to interfere with black's defense by playing this very, very powerful move that I had overlooked, rook to e1, which just asks this bishop where it's going to go. The problem is it needs to stay on this diagonal to prevent queen h7 and queen h8. So it has to stay, you know, somewhere along this diagonal. Not many places for it to go, but it has to. But it also has to stay along this diagonal because it needs to prevent rook g3. And, you know, you'll notice these diagonals only intersect in one square on e5, and the bishop can't stay there. So it's not looking great. The only way to try to keep the bishop here is queen b8 to defend it, but there are many problems with this. The most obvious is white can pick up material immediately. There are almost certainly other problems as well, like even f4 is kind of difficult to deal with. And so the only other thing that we can try is what I played in the game, which was taking the knight. There are very clear tactical issues with this, but I think this is the only thing that we can reasonably do. My opponent took on e5, liquidating the only defender we have of the king. And after takes king f8, white is regaining the material. Now, technically, you know, at least we've gotten the king to safety, but our bishop is not a piece. We're down to clear a pawn, and we are losing a second pawn after rook d3, so objectively this position is pretty much resignable. Obviously, we're not actually going to resign it, we're going to struggle on, but white is completely winning. The only saving grace, again, is that my opponent had about 10 minutes at this point, so at this point the name of the game becomes just trying to make things as complicated as possible, refuse to lose as long as we can, make their conversion a little bit tricky, as much as we possibly can, and if they solve the problems, you know, fine. There's some kind of freeing feeling sometimes about having a completely lost position like this. Whatever you do doesn't matter. It's all on your opponent. Either, you know, if they're in shape, you lose. If not, okay, something can happen. So we tried to mix it up a little bit. Started with rook c8, hitting the bishop. Now, if white takes immediately, this is probably also fine for... well, actually, yeah, this was a trick I was hoping for, I guess. I mean, even this is probably fine. But it looks a little bit dangerous to allow rook c5. This forces c4. And then, I don't know, maybe b5 is annoying. It's probably not really, but maybe it visually looks like it. In any case, my opponent decided to play bishop b3, which is a little bit more stable. I guess after takes on d5, you also have to worry about giving the c2 pawn was probably the main thing he was concerned about. Now there is a mate threat, so... white does need to take a little bit of time out to defend that, and at least now we're only down one pawn instead of a lot. So my opponent played bishop b3, sort of the same principle as last time. This pawn can be taken whenever, so there's no need to do it now. I played a5, trying to at least brandish the idea of trapping the bishop. And the trick that I was bluffing was that, oh, you can't take on d5 because I have this very nice move rook c5. And now you're in big trouble, because if you take, we have back rank mate. And if you don't, then we're picking up the rook. But my opponent either missed rook c5 or saw through this trick, because white can, of course, just take the queen and then defend the back rank mate. And now white is very, very comfortably up 2 pawns for not a whole lot. The actual trick here that I was hoping my opponent might fall for is c4 here again. Looks very natural, defending the rook. But here we would actually turn the game completely around, which would be very, very sad for my opponent, very happy for me. And take, not with the rook, but with the queen, exploiting once again back rank issues. After takes rook c1, white cannot deal with the back rank. So this, in my mind, was my final trick. This is what I played a5 hoping for. When my opponent took on d8, I figured, okay, I tried. We'll play on, but the result is no longer in doubt. The position plays itself, and even with no time, white can always make, any number of nothing moves, just passing around for a while to gain some time on the clock. So even if this becomes complicated, which it won't, this isn't a rook endgame that white needs to be particularly careful in, then white will always be able to just blitz out 10 random moves, get another 5 minutes on the clock, figure something out, blitz another 10 random moves, and so on. But we carry on nonetheless. b5, just trying to at least force white to take on e6, so we correct our pawn structure a little bit. King f1, we played f4, trying to keep some space. My opponent did take, which, okay, small accomplishment. At least we corrected the pawn structure a little. And now we start the true rook endgame, where white has obviously 6 pawns versus 4. So a 3 versus 2 majority on both sides. The way white is going to win this position is very simple. He's just going to make a pass pawn on both sides, probably exchange some of these pawns, exchange some of these pawns, and just run whichever pass pawns remain down the board. The only thing that he has to be careful of is making sure that the pass pawns that he's left with are not specifically the A and H pawns, because that can be a theoretical draw under some circumstances. And then also, I guess a G pawn and an A pawn under some very specific circumstances can also be a draw. Because if the pawn is all the way on a7 and the rook is on a8 and our rook is behind it and our king is on h7 or something, then once we do the typical maneuver of shuffling our king between h7 and g7, maybe a G pawn isn't actually going to be able to interfere with that. Once it runs to g6, we can give a bunch of checks with the rook or something. I don't know. But it's kind of a moot point here, because the pass pawns that are going to be created at this point are almost certainly a C pawn, and maybe an F pawn, maybe a G pawn, doesn't really matter. Even an A pawn, even the H pawn would be fine. So it would white would have to actively try in order to get a bad configuration of 2 pawns. My opponent played rook d4. The exact moves here aren't going to matter so much. Played rook c5, trying to at least be a little confusing. c3, e5, bring the king in. I actually expected king f3 here, but f3 is fine. Basically, white is going to eventually trade one of these pawns over here. Keep a pass pawn either with the h pawn or the g pawn. Exchange a set of pawns over here. Game is pretty decided. But we struggle on a little bit. Rook c8, trying to get the rook active again. g4 is a nice move, forces us to take. Now there is a pass g pawn, so step 1 is kind of complete for white. Rook g8, rook g4 is also a nice move. White is up 2 pawns, so he can afford to give one back to go into a pawn endgame. We're not able to trade. So white activates the king once again. Now mission accomplished on the queen side as well. One set of pawns is traded off, and white just needs to trade another one. G-pawn is now advanced and very, very secure. My opponent repeated once to gain some time. This is the sort of thing that I meant when I said that white can always gain some time. Black has no ideas, we just have to keep doing our thing. So by, white is clearly going to go to a3, but by going to c3 first, he gains 2 more moves of increment. So he gets an extra minute on the clock before going to a3, and he can kind of repeat this procedure however much he wants whenever he needs an extra minute on the clock to think. So even though at this point he's down to, 3 or 4 minutes, it's effectively infinite time, because white can always do some kind of repetition, or just shuffle the rook around. It doesn't need to be an explicit repetition at this point, and gain 30 seconds whenever necessary. So the shuffling continues, not a lot going on. Once again, white is accomplishing the mission of creating an uncontested pass pawn. Takes. King side is fully resolved. G-pawn is revved up and ready to go. But I was a little surprised at my opponent's plan here, which was to trade the G-pawn for the A-pawn, because this is a little bit harder. Not hard, still very, very easy. But I thought that this was a small accomplishment for me, because at least the 2 pass pawns are on the same side now, which means the king can try to not hold both of them, but at least kind of interfere with both of them. I thought it would probably be simpler for my opponent to just trade off, another one of these pawns. Maybe with b4 here would be easier. Maybe some other way of freeing the pawns up, like king b3, a4, king a3, b4, whatever. Just anything that trades like 2 of the queenside pawns, I thought would probably be a little bit easier of a conversion. But my opponent was obviously aware that rook a and b against rook is a very, very easy win. I just wasn't sure if he knew how to do it, because it can be a little tricky, as we'll see. We try to interfere with the pawns advancing as long as we can. I knew, obviously, that we're not going to be able to stop it forever. But the main point is that, we have this configuration. If this pawn were not here, this would be a very typical Philidor defense. And the point is that white can never advance this pawn, because then we slide behind the king and start checking it forever. But since there's a pawn here, there is no check along the a-file. The pawn offers the king shelter. And so white can slowly advance these pawns using the king, sort of the help of all of the other pieces. He just has to be a little bit careful about how he does it, because if we start with b5 immediately, now the king gets driven quite a bit far back, and it's actually a very unpleasant configuration. Now the pawns are kind of stuck. So generally, in order to advance the pawns, white needs to advance the a-pawn first, which is what my opponent started to do. Shuffled around a little bit, brought the rook to the 3rd rank to cover the retreat of the king, getting out of the way. In the meantime, obviously, we're just shuffling, and this is, again, where white can gain time. If white wants to gain a minute or 2 on the clock, he can just put his rook anywhere random, and we're just going to have to keep shuffling back and forth. But my opponent sort of demonstrated the correct way of advancing the pawns. Now, by advancing the a-pawn first, there are no checks from the side, and white's king is going to be very, very sheltered on where the a-file is. So we can try to interfere with it for a move or 2, but again, the a-pawn moves first, opening up avenue for the king. Then the b-pawn advances, and this procedure continues. So, we try to interfere briefly, but this part will always occur. Now the interesting part of the endgame begins. How do you actually advance them any further? Because if, we're just going to be passing forever. We have to stay on their 8th rank, because otherwise the king will get forced out, and white makes a very simple queen. But now, if white continues the same procedure of playing a7, king a8, and like king a6 or something, intending b6 and b7 mate, now the king is actually stalemated. And this introduces some serious difficulty for white, because if we can get rid of this rook, the game is a draw. So, for example, after rook f6, the procedure up until now would have been to play b6 to shelter the king from any checks, but here we can actually snap it off, and the game is stalemate. If white even tries to correct his mistake here and say, okay, well, I can't play b6, same problem. We just continue checking. This is called the, suicide rook, mad rook, whatever you want to call it. And no matter where the king goes, we will continue checking it forever, really just saying, please, please take me. At any point you take me, it's a draw. And white actually has no way to escape all of these checks. So a7 here would be a very, very serious mistake. My opponent instead, at this point, probably realized, okay, a7 doesn't quite work. How do we figure it out? But he's playing on increment, so rook d7 is just kind of to gain time. We keep passing, king b6, we keep passing, rook d6, we keep passing, rook c6, we keep passing, rook d6, we keep passing, and then finally my opponent got frustrated and played the very serious blunder a7. And now after king a8, we have pulled off a crazy swindle, honestly, on move 77. After being lost from all the way back on like move 20, now the game is actually objectively a draw because once again, the king is stalemated and there is no way for white to avoid this stalemate procedure. Black is at any point now going to give away the rook. For example, we're already threatening to play rook h6, which is kind of a nice way of doing things. But my opponent's idea was that he's not going to give me the opportunity to blow away the rook just yet. He's going to play this unstalemate the king with this move king c7. And the point here is that if we take the pawn, we get mate in 1, so the pawn is immune. And in the meantime, white's plan is just to play, b6, b7, punch the pawn through to victory. The other threat is to play, like if we pass again, white will play rook d8, force off the rooks, and this pawn endgame is once again winning because the pawn will run down the board to victory. Not immediately, of course, because this is again stalemate, but in the slower approach by bringing the king to a6, this is a pretty well-known configuration where, yes, we do take the opposition with black, but because there's nowhere to retreat to off the edge of the board, it's not enough. If we had one more move, we'd be able to go back to, b9, and the pawn wouldn't be a queen just yet. But on the edge of the board, it's not enough. So my opponent probably thought that this was game over, but overlooked one more stalemate trick we had, which was to play check. And now after rook d7, again, we can't trade the rooks, and b6, b7 is coming. But since we've drawn the rook to the 7th rank, this is very, very clever. Now this rook is once again defending the pawn, sort of, if the king moves. And so we can play the move rook h6, presumably the move my opponent missed. Now after b6, we can just snap this off. And if, white tries to do anything else, now this pawn is under attack. It actually can't be defended. If we go back to d1, we're once again just going to check the king away. If we check the king away and take, now we very naturally reach filled our possession. And if white tries to block again, then we repeat. So an absolutely crazy swindle to hold the game. What happened next was even crazier. And probably the first time that this has ever happened in my career. Probably the only time it will ever happen until I'm older, and on the other side of this. But after king a8, rook h7, rook d7, rook h6, my opponent at this point realized, oh shit, b6 is not possible. I don't really have any other way of preserving this pawn on a7. Like, what have I done? Like, I think he sort of realized with horror at this point that the game was a draw. And so he started thinking about, like, how to at least make it tricky, which is a good adaptation. If you blow a win, you have to at least, like, think about, okay, how do I keep the game going? What I didn't expect, and I felt really, really awful after this turn of events, is my opponent spending so long trying to figure out how to make the game tricky that in this position, up 2 pawns in a rook endgame, my opponent actually flagged. And so in, like, the oddest ultimate swindle of all time, we actually won this game with the black pieces in completely undeserved fashion. So I still feel bad about this, honestly. I felt great when I made the stalemate trick, and I was like, haha, I've done it again. Ironically, this is not the first time that I've held a 2-pawn down endgame against this specific opponent in particular. I think 5 or 6 years ago, maybe even more, 8 years ago, I actually held a very similar position with A and C pawns, which is at least a theoretical draw in a similar kind of scenario where it wasn't really necessary to go into that endgame, but at the time I think he thought it was winning, and we did manage to survive. This time, obviously, it is theoretically winning, but we still managed to survive. That part felt great. Didn't feel as great to take a full point, a fully undeserved full point from here. But my opponent took it very, very well. Considering I probably would not take it as well, I probably would be staring into the ocean for quite a while. But I Yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to say. Somehow we came away with this with a full point. The correct procedure to win this position is a little bit unintuitive, and this is why I thought that I actually did have a little bit of chances going into this, was because, you know, what got you here is not what's going to get you over the finish line. Up until now, you've had to use the A pawn to give yourself shelter for the king so you can advance the B pawn, and so it's very intuitive that the same procedure should work. Like, there's no reason, really, that the same procedure shouldn't work other than this, like, weird, like, stalemate nonsense that feels like it shouldn't be that real a thing. Feels like, you know, there should be a couple tricks that you have to avoid, but it shouldn't be like a position that you actually need a fundamentally different strategy. It turns out that you actually kind of do. And I was surprised at this when I had this position from the other side. I had this in a Blitz tournament against Min Lei a few years back, where I was the one with the rook and H and G pawns against just the king and rook. Fortunately, I did win the game, but not because I knew how to do it. My opponent blundered in the defense. Or maybe he flagged too. I forget how. I just remember that I won, but I didn't know how to win. The actual procedure to do it is to pretty much, you know, let these pawns stay on their own. So black is still passing. B6, black is still passing. Again, we don't want to play a7. We don't want to stalemate the king. We don't want to play b7 either, because that also introduces some stalemate problems. For example, like, I don't remember what. Well, I guess b7 we can actually just kind of chill here and just give a lot of checks. It's actually not easy for white to make progress. Rook d8, we're always going to just give check again. And now king, one of the, I guess, an important stalemate point is that after king c8, it looks like the game is over. Well, actually, no, wait. I guess the game is over. I was going to say rook c7, but that's not stalemate. So maybe this actually works too. Maybe you can actually go for b7. As long as the rook is on the 6th rank. But the easiest way to do so, to finish this game, is to just put the rook on the e-file, play king d7, and then, you know, use the fact that the king is stuck over here with these two pawns to just trade off the rooks by force, then walk the king back and win easily with the king and two pawns against the king. I guess b7 maybe also is a way to do it. There's many ways to... There's a couple of different approaches you can take, but the simplest that I know of is just to bring the king over to the other side of the board and trade off the rooks, which I don't think is the most intuitive thing of all time. I don't really blame my opponent for missing it on increment. I was telling him after, I think, like, I don't know, you don't see a draw that often, but probably like 10% of the time, like, this does end in a draw, which is a shockingly high percent for what you would expect from a position that should, in principle, be very, very easy. Probably not a very high percentage of the person with the rook winning, but definitely some percentage of drawing. So, yeah, this was a weird one. I didn't really know how to react. I obviously felt really, really terrible for my opponent. I felt kind of dirty myself for I guess having the full point. Like, obviously I don't get the choice of not taking the full point, but still something that feels very, very dirty about it. Like, when people say dirty flag, they're usually saying it in a very prideful way. Like, oh yeah, I dirty flagged that guy. Like, it's a point of pride. It's not really, you're not really saying you feel like you did something dirty. Here, this was maybe the first time in my career that I actually felt like I did something, like, actively dirty. And I didn't. Like, I don't think there's anything dirty about it. I defended as best as I could. But something about it felt very, almost unsportsmanlike. I don't know. Weird set of feelings. Probably won't ever happen again, so I guess it won't end up being super relevant, but it was obviously very important for the tournament score. With this, we moved to 3 out of 4, which took the tournament from being, you know, basically a little bit average, especially after the disaster we had against Ivanchuk, to maybe even a slightly positive tournament, but definitely sort of back to a normal event. And it meant that we would get a pretty good pairing the next round, where we'd probably play a higher rated player, but not like a much higher rated player with the white pieces. So on paper, obviously, very, very happy to get the full point. I just wish that it was in a bit of a different manner. In any case, though, Hopefully this was interesting. The game itself, I don't really know if there's all that much to learn from, to be honest. I played pretty terribly in the beginning, got a losing position very, very quickly, and then had to do some shenaniganry and 80 moves later. But hopefully it was an interesting situation at least. I'm curious to hear if anybody's watching this and has ever had like something similar. You know, people flag, it happens, but people flagging, I guess, in a winning position doesn't really happen all that often. I'm very curious to hear if that has ever happened to any of you. I wonder what the percentage on that is. It's probably extraordinarily low. But in any case, thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time for round 5 of the Menorca Open, which, you know, this bought ourselves a good opportunity for, and as we'll see, it was entirely wasted. See you next time.